In most games, levels are the defining point of contact the game has with the player. Your mechanics, art, sound, and systems don't mean much if your player doesn't have a level in which to see, hear, and use them. As such, getting a strong foundation for how I plan to make levels for Altfire, the arena shooter I'm working on, is essential. I've spent the last few months building out a level creation pipeline that, for me, is fluid and flexible, and took the opportunity to start exploring the game's art style as well. I'm Nick, and this is an Altfire devlog about world creation. So you might be thinking to yourself, Nick, why levels this early? Wouldn't you rather be focusing on mechanics and enemies? And if you were thinking that, great question. Traditionally, you would be right. Focusing on core game components would be key to progressing the game forward. And to a degree, I have done that already. The player controllers in, key weapon and item systems, and even the basic core of the enemies. But permit me a brief aside. See, levels are what I like to call non-multiplier assets, as opposed to things like game code, art, sound, and other assets which are usually multipliers in nature. If it takes me 10 hours of work to get a new mechanic implemented, that code will be reused all over the project. Every time the player uses an ability, for example, it would be reused, and thus multiplies the value it adds to the project. Levels are not like that, at least not normally. Each level, in a single-player linear campaign setting at least, is non-multiplicative, since by its nature, you probably are only going to see that environment once. In fact, at times I'd go as far to say that levels in a campaign might represent negative multipliers, since the average player might spend very little time in part of a level that took significantly longer to make per second of playtime. However, I absolutely don't mean to say that the effort would be wasted. Were it missing, it would be noticed, or at least felt by the player. Much like animation, it's only when it goes wrong that the end user actually notices it. So, knowing I want to have a linear, story-driven campaign for Altfire, and given my area of expertise is in level design, level art, and environment design, I opted to tackle the process of making levels earlier than average. Setting up a fluid and flexible level-making pipeline so that I felt confident I could use it to deliver all the levels this game is going to need, which would take a huge weight off my chest. So, the first step was figuring out level geometry. I define level geometry as the core structure of the level: walls, floors, doors, windows, pillars, ramps, and so on. This would be what I use to structure the levels for gameplay as graybox maps, and then also, hopefully, use them for final geometry with textures and materials. Within and around Unreal, there are a number of geometry editing pipelines. The ones I explored for making levels were modular kit systems, cube grid, modeling tools, trench broom, and BSP. For brevity, I'll summarize my findings, but if you want to know more in depth, let me know in the comments below. Having been a level designer and level artist for years, I am intimately familiar with modular kits, and as such, I know they would take way too long to make and way too long to go between graybox and complete. Even using code to turn them into nifty, reusable kit pieces, they still had the same inflexible clunk all modular kits do. What I needed was geometry editing tools. Considering the lo-fi art style I intend for Altfire, I want to make bulky geometry that I can slap textures on. That's it. So, with wide eyes, I turned to CubeGrid, a blocky level prototyping tool Unreal offers as part of their modeling tools, and it's what all the levels in the game up until now were made with. However, it too didn't work out, since it really wasn't built with level artists in mind. The friction with texturing, baking light maps, and adjusting geometry just pushed it over the line. I briefly considered using the modeling tools themselves, but again, they aren't built with fluid and flexible level design at their core, so they were out too. Around this time, I started watching a Project Feline devlog, where the developer showed off a neat tool they were using for their level design, Trench Broom. A separate app, it is a modernized BSP-based Quake editor, which could export as static meshes, and then you could bring those into Unreal. Despite not being enthused about the level designing happening in a separate app from Unreal, at least the workflow was closer to what I was looking for. Unfortunately, it too didn't work out because of the fundamental issue with large, singular meshes in Unreal. And the plugin to make it break them up into pieces didn't work with my version of Unreal Engine 5. All of which led me back to an old friend, BSP. BSP, or binary space partitions, is a very old method of making 3D geometry. If you've ever made maps for the original Quake, Doom, Counter-Strike, Gmod, Half-Life, or other Source Engine games, or even older Unreal games like Unreal Gold or Unreal Tournament, you'd have been making those using BSP. Despite how it was presented in this video, I actually have a boatload of experience with BSP, both as full level creation tools in older engines, and as grayboxing tools in Unreal Engine 4. I use it for grayboxing in Unreal Tournament, and all the levels in Evasive maneuvers were actually made with BSP as well. Having grown up using it and carrying that expertise into my career, I find it flexible since you can edit the primitives easily at any time. I can move efficiently because I can just add and copy shapes in context in the world, ultimately kind of massaging a level into place, kind of like molding clay. It has modest but predictable selection and texturing tools. Geometry is just stored in the level itself, so no new assets are generated and stored in the project. And it has a dynamic scaling light map resolution that, by design, supports baked light maps. Despite all that praise from me, the conversation surrounding BSP online is often, you should only use it for prototyping, or it's old, they're phasing it out and you shouldn't use it, or it's unperformant and prone to glitches. Those that don't outright dismiss BSP will say it's fine, but you have to convert it into a static mesh before shipping. A destructive process, mind you, that can make for giant glitchy meshes you end up having to edit in Blender. Anyways, even Epic themselves recommend not using it for final geometry in their documentation. And the thing is that that's not entirely wrong. But I think the more important lesson I've learned from this whole process is this. Does it work for you? For me, using BSP gets me from nothing to a level in half an hour, and from a level to a finished level in a few hours, at least as far as Altfire's art style is concerned. All while having a frictionless and fun time making it. And I'd like to take a second to highlight that second point. Fun. Do I want to sit down to make level 14 out of 100 saying, oh my god, I don't even want to bother with all this fuss, I don't want to do this? No, I'd rather be excited to do it, since the player's going to feel that joy and love in the final game itself. Plus, it's not like I didn't do my due diligence. I pressure tested working with BSP, finding its performance limits, behavioral exceptions, and learning the workarounds that I'll have to consider. So what about all the flaws of BSP? Yeah, they're there. It is kind of clunky, depending on your use case. It's not good for detail, and it does produce strange glitches at times. So, no, it's not perfect. But nothing is. And I'd rather work around BSP's flaws than the flaws of modular kits, cube grid, or giant meshes. So, to wrap up part 1 here, I'll say this. If you are a level designer, or budding level designer, and you just can't get into the groove with the tools that you have on hand, explore other options. You never know what might click for your workflow, and whatever that is, I think it will make for your best work yet. This was part 1 of a 2-part devlog on Altfire's world creation learning process. The second part will show more about textures, props, and the game's nascent art style. I also notice a lack of conversation around BSP and Unreal Engine 5 as a viable alternative, like how I've found it, so I probably will make a video about that at some point, since I think that it's useful information, even if you don't end up using it yourself. There are links below if you want to follow the project on Blue Sky or itch.io. There's also links to SkyPyre's Discord, which now has an Altfire section, and we also have an official webpage for the game at skypyre.com/altfire with a dash, which will be expanded as the project progresses. So, I'll see you in part 2, and until next time, take care.